The incident at Nexus Point sent ripples through the Galactic Assembly like a stone thrown into still water, and suddenly Ambassador Liu Wei found that his requests for meetings were being answered with unprecedented speed, and the Council wanted explanations for how humans had performed feats that their biological assessment said should be impossible. And Liu knew this was both an opportunity and a danger, because the Assembly was now paying attention to humanity. But attention could cut both ways. The Vakreen Prime Minister called an emergency session 3 weeks after the attack, and the council chamber was fuller than Liu had ever seen it, with representatives from species that normally did not bother attending routine meetings. But everyone wanted to hear the explanation for what had happened, and the Prime Minister's mandibles clicked rapidly, which Liu had learned meant agitation or concern. And it addressed Liu directly in that flat translated voice that somehow made every statement sound like an accusation. The Prime Minister stated that Commander Jake Morrison had killed 6 Zareth raiders in less than 1 minute, and the Zareth were enhanced warriors whose armor could withstand direct plasma fire, and whose reaction times were 3 times faster than most species, and yet a human who was supposed to be physically inferior had eliminated them with an efficiency rating that would be remarkable even for elite Corvan shock troops, and the Council wanted to know how this was possible. Liu smiled politely and explained that Commander Morrison was well trained, and had served in Earth's military for over 20 years before joining the diplomatic corps, and the training regimen for human soldiers was quite rigorous and comprehensive. But even as he said it, he could see that this answer did not satisfy the Council because training alone did not explain the gap between human performance and human biology. The Threen ambassador spoke next, and its colors shifted between red and yellow, which meant curiosity mixed with fear, and it pointed out that Lieutenant Amy Pierce had lifted a 400-kilogram support beam and held it for 23 seconds, while her hands were literally being burned by thermal radiation, and most species would have dropped the beam immediately from the pain, and some would have died from the shock. But Amy had simply held it until the civilians were safe, and then calmly walked away. The Corvan war chief Zaxor stood, and his voice was a low growl, as he explained that he had reviewed footage of human behavior across multiple incidents, and the pattern was consistent, as humans constantly surprised the Assembly with capabilities that their biology should not allow, and he had fought beside and against hundreds of species during his career, and he knew the difference between skill and something else, and humans possessed something else that none of them understood. Liu maintained his pleasant expression, but inside he was calculating rapidly because he knew that this moment would determine humanity's future relationship with the Assembly, and he could deflect and minimize and try to downplay human capabilities, or he could take the risk of being honest and hoping that honesty would build trust instead of fear. And he decided that hiding what humans were would only make things worse when the truth inevitably came out. He asked the Council for permission to bring in an expert, and Dr. Helen Carter entered the chamber looking slightly nervous but determined, and she carried a portable holographic projector that she set up in the center of the speaking area, and Liu introduced her as Earth's lead xenobiologist and an expert on comparative evolution, and Helen took a deep breath before beginning her presentation. She activated the hologram to show Earth rotating slowly in space, and she explained that most species in the Assembly had evolved on worlds with relatively stable climates and abundant resources, and few existential threats, and they had developed intelligence as a tool for cooperation and resource management, and their evolution had been shaped by the need to work together and build societies and maintain peace. The hologram shifted to show various predators from Earth's history, and there were lions with their massive jaws, and bears with their powerful claws, and wolves hunting in coordinated packs and sharks gliding through dark water. And Helen's voice was steady as she explained that Earth was different because everything on their planet had been trying to kill them for millions of years, and humans had no natural weapons and no armor and no speed advantage. She zoomed the hologram in on a human brain and highlighted specific regions as she explained that humans had developed something else instead of physical advantages, and they had developed persistence, which was the ability to push their bodies far beyond normal limits, and they had developed pain tolerance that most species considered pathological, and they had developed tactical thinking that functioned even under extreme stress, and most importantly, they had developed the capacity to choose to act despite overwhelming fear. The chamber was silent as Helen continued, and she explained that what the assembly called weakness was actually just the human baseline, and what they called impossible was what humans did every Tuesday, and the biological scans had measured human resting state and assumed that was the maximum. But humans did not have a maximum in the traditional sense because they had evolved on a world where having a maximum meant death. Helen pulled up comparative data showing human stress response, and she explained that when humans encountered danger, their bodies flooded with chemicals that increased strength and speed and pain tolerance and reaction time, and this was not a rare ability but rather a universal human trait that every member of their species possessed to varying degrees, and the assembly had never seen it because they had only tested humans in safe, controlled conditions. The Vakreen Prime Minister's mandibles stopped clicking, and it leaned forward with obvious interest as it asked Helen to clarify whether she was saying that every human could perform the feats they had witnessed, and Helen nodded and explained that yes, generally speaking, any human could push into what they called combat readiness or adrenaline response when the situation required it, and some individuals were better at controlling and directing this response, but all humans had access to it. Zaxor stood again, and his scales rippled with barely contained energy as he described watching Jake Morrison fight, and the war chief's voice was intense as he explained that Morrison's eyes had been calm and calculated during the entire engagement, and there had been no panic and no hesitation, and the human had moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times before, and Zaxor wanted to know how someone could be that calm while fighting for their life. Helen's answer was simple, but its implications were profound as she explained that humans could not breed fear out of their species the way some warrior races had done, and so instead they had learned to fight with fear, and through fear. And despite fear, and human military training focused heavily on teaching people to function effectively while terrified, and it was not about eliminating the fear, but rather about acting anyway. She pulled up footage from human military training, and the council watched as human trainees were put through scenarios designed to terrify them, and then required to perform complex tasks, while their bodies were flooded with stress hormones, and the footage showed humans making tactical decisions while explosions went off around them, and treating wounded while under fire and maintaining formation while everything around them collapsed into chaos. The Threen ambassador's colors shifted to a deep purple that indicated profound concern, and it asked the question that everyone was thinking, which was whether Earth was classified as a death world. And Helen nodded and explained that yes, Earth was rated as a Category 9 death world, which made it more hostile than the homeworld of any current Assembly member species. She explained that Earth had extreme temperature variations and frequent natural disasters and weather patterns that could kill in minutes, and an ecosystem full of creatures that had evolved specifically to hunt and kill, and this had been humanity's environment for their entire evolutionary history. And they had survived not by becoming stronger or faster or better armored, but by becoming more persistent and more adaptable, and more willing to continue fighting even when wounded and exhausted and terrified. Zaxor asked about human pain tolerance, and Helen brought up medical data showing that humans regularly continued to function with injuries that would incapacitate most species. And she showed footage of human athletes competing with broken bones, and soldiers fighting with wounds that should have caused shock and death, and civilians performing rescue operations while injured themselves, and the pattern was consistent across all demographics and all situations. A Corvin counselor stood and pointed out that humans seemed to become more effective as situations worsened, and asked if this was a deliberate trait, and Helen explained that yes, in a way it was, because humans had evolved as persistence hunters, who tracked prey for days or weeks at a time, and the ability to continue functioning when exhausted and in pain and desperate was what had allowed humans to survive and eventually dominate their planet. She explained that human ancestors had hunted animals that were faster and stronger by simply refusing to stop chasing them, and the prey would run until exhausted and collapse and die while the humans just kept coming. And this hunting strategy had shaped every aspect of human psychology and physiology and had created a species that 6 months had passed since the Assembly rejected humanity's petition, and Earth's small delegation now occupied a modest station on Nexus Point, which was a massive trading hub where ships from 1,000 worlds came to exchange goods and information and ideas, and Commander Jake Morrison had been reassigned to what everyone politely called administrative duties, but what really meant processing endless forms and trade requests and scientific exchange applications, and it was boring work that made him miss the stars. But at least it kept humanity's presence visible in assembly space. Lieutenant Amy Pierce had replaced Kyle on the station, and she spent most of her free time in the observation deck, watching ships arrive and depart in an endless dance of commerce and exploration, and she had studied every species in the assembly database until she could identify most of them on site, and former Marine Sergeant Chris Bennett handled security for the human section, which mostly involved making sure drunk traders did not wander into restricted areas and occasionally breaking up fights between species who had old grudges against each other that went back centuries before humans even discovered fire. The attack came on a Tuesday morning station time, and there was no warning at all as the Zareth raiders dropped out of faster-than-light travel, already firing their weapons, and their fleet consisted of 40 warships that looked like they had been built from scrap metal and nightmares, and they were a rogue faction that had broken away from the assembly decades ago, and now survived by raiding and stealing and taking slaves from anyone weak enough to be victimized. Alarms screamed through every corridor of Nexus Point, and Amy was in the main docking bay inspecting a newly arrived cargo shipment when the first explosion shook the entire station, and emergency bulkheads started slamming down to contain the damage, and she ran toward the control center to find out what was happening. But she only made it halfway before she saw them through a viewport. The Zareth ships were smaller than assembly warships, but they moved faster and fought dirtier, and they targeted life support systems and power generators, and anywhere that would cause maximum chaos and panic, and the assembly security force mobilized, immediately under the command of Corvan War Chief Zaxor. But they were outnumbered and outgunned, and the defensive batteries that should have protected the station had been damaged in the first volley. Sections of the station began to decompress as the Zareth weapons punched through the hull, and Amy watched through a viewport as a Threen family was trapped behind a collapsed support beam in Corridor 7 Delta, and fire was spreading through that section from a ruptured plasma conduit, and the parents were trying to shield their two young ones with their own bodies. But the flames were getting closer, and the heat was already buckling the deck plates beneath them. Amy did not think about what she was doing as she grabbed an emergency toolkit from the wall locker and ran toward Corridor 7 Delta, and Chris saw her go on the security cameras, and he cursed loudly before grabbing a fire suppression unit and following because he knew that Amy was about to do something stupidly heroic and someone needed to be there to pull her out when it all went wrong. The heat in Corridor 7 Delta was intense enough that Amy's suit readouts immediately started flashing warnings about thermal overload, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with the temperature, and she could feel her skin starting to burn even through the protective layers of her uniform. But she kept moving toward the trapped family, and she found a hydraulic jack in the emergency toolkit and wedged it under the fallen support beam. Chris reached her position just as she started cranking the jack, and he positioned the fire suppression unit to give them a few seconds of breathable air, and he shouted through the comm that her suit could not handle this heat, and she needed to abort. But Amy just kept cranking the jack with steady mechanical precision, and her hands were already blistering inside her gloves as the heat conducted through the metal tools. The support beam weighed at least 400 kilograms according to the structural specs, and it should have required powered equipment to lift. But Amy kept working the jack, and her muscles screamed in protest, and her skin was burning, and every instinct in her body was telling her to run. But she had seen the eyes of those young Threen looking up at their parents, and she was not about to let them die because a piece of metal was heavy. The beam lifted slowly, and Chris pulled the Threen family out one by one, and the parents were making a high-pitched keening sound that Amy's translator rendered as gratitude mixed with disbelief, and the two young ones were crying, but alive, and Chris got all four of them to safety, while Amy held the jack in place, and only when they were clear did she release it and stumble backward with her hands shaking and her vision blurring from the pain. In the command center, Jake was coordinating with assembly forces when the security alert showed a Zareth boarding party breaching Section 7, and they were heading straight for the civilian shelters, where over 200 beings from a dozen different species had taken refuge, and the Corvan warriors were 3 minutes away, which meant the civilians had maybe 1 minute before the raiders reached them. Jake grabbed a plasma rifle from the emergency armory, and Helen turned from her console to tell him he was not cleared for combat operations under their observer status. But Jake was already moving toward the door, and he told her to take command and get everyone to the core, and his voice was calm and level, despite the fact that he was about to violate every rule the assembly had set for human conduct. He moved through the corridors faster than he had moved in years, and muscle memory from decades of training took over his body and guided his movements, and he found the Zareth in the residential quarter, just as they were setting charges on the shelter door, and there were 6 of them in heavy armor with weapons that could cut through bulkheads, and they were professional and methodical, and completely focused on their objective, which meant they did not see Jake until he dropped the first one with a shot to the neck joint where the armor was thinnest. The fight lasted 45 seconds from first shot to last, and Jake moved through it like he was dancing to music. Only he could hear, and he used cover that the Zareth did not even know existed, and he exploited angles that should not have given him clear shots, and when his rifle overheated, he transitioned to his sidearm without breaking rhythm, and when that ran dry, he picked up a fallen raider's weapon and kept firing. The Corvin warriors arrived to find Jake standing among 6 dead Zareth, with his shoulder bleeding from a glancing hit, and his breathing was controlled and steady, and his eyes were absolutely calm as he checked each body to make sure they would not get back up, and War Chief Zaxor stood in the doorway analyzing the scene with his combat computer. And the efficiency rating came back at 94%, which meant almost no wasted motion and no hesitation and no mistakes. Zaxor had seen a lot of combat in his long career, and he had fought beside some of the best warriors in the galaxy. And he knew what it looked like when someone fought with desperation, and he knew what it looked like when someone fought with skill. And this was neither of those things, because Jake Morrison had fought with a cold, calculated precision that suggested he had done this exact thing 1,000 times before, and it had become boring. The Zareth retreated after losing 3 boarding parties and taking heavy casualties from the Assembly Defense Force, and Nexus Point was saved, but the cost had been high, with sections of the station destroyed and dozens of beings injured, and the rescue operations went on for hours as crews worked to pull survivors from collapsed sections and restore life support to damaged areas. Amy's hands were bandaged and back to treated by the time the medical teams got to her, and Chris had cracked 3 ribs that he had not bothered to mention during the fighting, and Jake's shoulder wound turned out to be deeper than it looked and required surgery to repair severed muscle tissue, and all 3 humans were ordered to medical bay for observation and rest. But the real aftermath of the attack was not physical, as word spread through Nexus Point about what the humans had done, and the Threen family that Amy saved told everyone who would listen about the human who ran into fire to save them, and the civilians in the shelter told stories about the human who fought 6 armored raiders alone and won. And suddenly beings who had barely noticed the human delegation before were paying very close attention. Zaxor requested the security footage from Jake's fight, and he watched it 17 times trying to understand what he had seen, and his tactical officers watched it with him, and they ran simulations to see how their own warriors would have handled the same situation, and the results were troubling because the Corvin fighters were bigger and stronger and faster than humans, but the simulations showed they would have taken longer and sustained more casualties, and might not have succeeded at all. The Threen ambassador came to visit Amy in medical, and its colors shifted through patterns that the translator struggled to interpret, and it asked her how she had lifted that support beam when the specifications said it should have been impossible for her species, and Amy just shrugged with her bandaged hands resting in her lap, and told the ambassador that the family needed help, so she helped them, and everything else was just details. The Galactic Assembly chamber stretched wider than any building on Earth, and the walls glowed with a soft blue light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as Commander Jake Morrison stood in the center of the massive hall with his hands clasped behind his back and his uniform perfectly pressed despite the long journey through space that had brought him here. And beside him stood Dr. Helen Carter, who kept adjusting her glasses nervously while Lieutenant Kyle Mason remained perfectly still, with his eyes constantly moving across the crowd of alien beings that filled the chamber from floor to ceiling. The chamber held representatives from over 1,000 different species, and each one looked more strange and wonderful than the last, as there were beings made of crystal that refracted light in rainbow patterns, and creatures that floated in tanks of liquid methane, and insectoid aliens with too many legs to count, and reptilian warriors covered in scales that looked harder than steel. And Jake had studied all their files during the 3-month journey to reach this place, but seeing them in person was something entirely different, as the air itself hummed with the sound of 1,000 different voices speaking in languages that no human throat could ever produce. The Vakrine Prime Minister rose from its seat at the center of the High Council platform, and it stood nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms and mandibles that clicked together rhythmically as it surveyed the chamber, and when it raised one of its arms, the entire assembly fell silent in a way that made Jake think of ancient churches back on Earth, where even breathing seemed too loud, and the Prime Minister's translator device rendered its chittering voice into flat, emotionless words that echoed through the vast space with perfect clarity. The verdict had been decided after 3 months of deliberation and tests and examinations, and humanity's petition for full membership in the Galactic Assembly was being denied, and Jake felt Kyle tense beside him, but the lieutenant remained silent, as they had been trained to do, and Helen stopped adjusting her glasses and went completely still as the Prime Minister continued to speak in that flat, translated voice that somehow made the rejection feel even more brutal. The Threen ambassador spoke next, and it was a being made of something like gelatin that shifted colors with each word it spoke, and its translator explained that humanity lacked the physical capabilities required for contribution to the collective defense of assembly space. And Jake listened as the ambassador listed all the ways humans were inferior to other species, as they had no natural armor, and their strength was below average, and their speed was unremarkable, and their senses were limited, and their lifespan was short, and on the list went until it felt like a recitation of every way that evolution had failed to prepare humans for life among the stars. A Corvan war chief stood next, and he was massive even by alien standards, with scales that bore deep scars from countless battles, and his voice was a low rumble that the translator barely managed to convert into understandable speech, and he explained that while Earth's technology was impressive, technology could be shared with any species, but weakness could not be trained away, and the biological scans of human physiology showed that they were among the most fragile species to ever request admission to the assembly, and Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach because he knew exactly what scans the war chief was referring to, as they had been poked and prodded and measured in every way imaginable during the application process. Helen stepped forward then, and her voice was steady despite the nervousness she had shown earlier, and she addressed the assembly with respect, but also with firmness, as she pointed out humanity's technological achievements and their medical advances, and their mathematical discoveries and their artistic contributions. But the Threen ambassador interrupted her with colors shifting to an impatient red, and explained that technology and art were valuable, but the assembly required members who could defend their territories and protect their citizens, and humanity simply did not meet the minimum physical requirements for such duties. The Vakrine Prime Minister raised all 4 arms then to signal the final verdict, and it explained that humanity would be granted observer status, which meant they could trade with assembly members, and they could learn from assembly schools, and they could attend council meetings, but they could not vote on matters of security, and they could not lead military operations, and most importantly, they would not be expected to defend assembly space, because it would be unfair to ask such a fragile species to stand against the dangers that lurked in the dark spaces between stars. The dismissal was clear and absolute, and Jake felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders like a physical burden as he nodded once to acknowledge the verdict and turned to leave the chamber, with Helen and Kyle following behind him, and the 3 humans walked through the crowd of alien delegates in complete silence. And Jake kept his face carefully neutral, even though inside he felt a burning mixture of anger and shame and determination that he would never let show on his face. But something strange happened as they walked toward the exit, and Jake noticed it first as several of the alien delegates nearest to them went very still and watched the humans pass with an intensity that seemed odd, given that they had just been dismissed as too weak to matter, and a Threen merchant who had been chattering loudly to his companion fell silent as Kyle walked past, and the merchant's colors shifted to a deep purple that Jake had learned meant confusion or concern. Kyle's eyes were moving constantly as they walked, and he tracked every exit and every potential threat and every being that moved too quickly, and he did it without seeming to try, as if his brain was simply built to process that much information. All at once, and Helen's gaze lingered on the weapon belts of the Corvan warriors they passed, and Jake knew she was analyzing the design and calculating effective ranges and weak points, because that was simply how her mind worked, and Jake himself maintained that same perfectly calm expression that had gotten him through 100 dangerous situations back on Earth, because showing emotion was weakness, and weakness was something they apparently had enough of already. The Threen ambassador watched the humans leave, and its colors shifted to that troubled purple that indicated deep concern. And it had seen eyes like those before many centuries ago when it was young and studying galactic history, and there had been a species called the Krell, who had nearly conquered half the galaxy before they destroyed themselves in civil war. And the Krell had possessed that same calm, calculating gaze that seemed to see everything and miss nothing and process threats faster than conscious thought should allow. But surely these humans were different, as the scans had proven beyond doubt that they were physically weak, and their bones were fragile, and their muscles were inadequate, and their bodies could not withstand even moderate levels of damage without failing, and yet something about the way they moved through the chamber made the Threen ambassador deeply uncomfortable in a way it could not quite explain. The Corvan war chief Zaxor had noticed it too, and he prided himself on being able to read warriors from any species, and he had fought beside and against hundreds of different beings during his long military career. And he knew the difference between someone who was trained and someone who was dangerous, and these humans were definitely trained, but there was something else in their movements that set off alarm bells in the back of his mind. Jake Morrison led his small delegation out of the assembly chamber and into the corridor beyond, and only when the massive doors had closed behind them did he finally allow himself to take a deep breath, and Helen sagged against the wall for just a moment before straightening again, and Kyle's hands unclenched from the fists they had formed, and the three humans looked at each other in the empty corridor and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. They had come to the stars hoping to find their place among the great civilizations of the galaxy, and instead they had been told they were too weak to matter, and too fragile to trust with important duties, and too limited to ever be anything more than observers watching from the sidelines as the real species did the real work of protecting and governing and building the future. But Jake Morrison had not become a commander by accepting other people's opinions of what he could or could not do, and as he looked at Helen and Kyle, he saw that same stubborn determination reflected in their eyes, and he knew that this rejection was not the end of anything, but rather the beginning of something that the Galactic Assembly was not quite ready to understand. The Assembly Council convened an emergency session 3 weeks after Helen's presentation, and the chamber buzzed with tension as representatives debated humanity's status, and the vote had been scheduled, but before it could take place, the Vakreen Prime Minister made an announcement that changed everything, as it declared that humanity would be tested, and if humans truly possessed the capabilities they claimed, then they would not object to a demonstration under real combat conditions. Ambassador Liu kept his face carefully neutral, but inside his mind was racing, because a test meant risk, and risk meant the possibility of failure. And failure would mean permanent rejection from the assembly, but refusing the test would also mean rejection. So there was really only one choice, and he nodded his agreement before asking what form this test would take. The Zareth had taken hostages during their raid on Nexus Point, and intelligence had located them in a fortress on a planet called Drakkar 4, and the Assembly was already planning a rescue operation, and Zaxor stepped forward to explain that humans would participate in the ground assault, and the mission would demonstrate whether human capabilities were real or simply the result of luck and favorable circumstances during the Nexus Point incident. Liu asked what role humans would play, and Zaxor's expression showed what might have been a smile or a challenge, as he explained that the ground assault team would face the most difficult conditions because Drakkar 4 had gravity that was 1.8 times Earth standard, and most assembly species would be operating at reduced capacity, while humans claimed to excel in difficult conditions, so this would be an ideal test. Commander Jake Morrison and Lieutenant Amy Pierce were recalled from Nexus Point, and Sergeant Chris Bennett volunteered immediately when he heard about the mission, and Captain Lisa Grant was assigned as their pilot, and the 4 humans attended the mission briefing aboard the assembly carrier that would transport them to Drakkar 4, and they stood among 40 assembly warriors who were all veterans of countless battles. The briefing hologram showed the Zareth fortress built into the side of a mountain, and intelligence estimated 200 hostages in the lower levels, with approximately 500 Zareth defenders, and the fortress had shields and automated defenses and multiple fallback positions, and Zaxor explained that the assault would proceed in 3 waves with air support, followed by breach teams, and finally extraction units. Zaxor pointed at the human contingent and explained that they would be with his personal squad in the second wave, and if they could not keep pace with Corvin warriors in heavy gravity, they should stay behind because the assault would not slow down for anyone. And Jake met the war chief's eyes and said they understood. And there was something in Jake's calm expression that made several of the alien warriors shift uncomfortably. The dropships descended through Drakkar 4's atmosphere 3 days later, and Lisa piloted their craft through anti-aircraft fire that lit up the sky like deadly fireworks. And in the troop hold, the assault team braced for impact as explosions rocked the ship, and Amy checked her weapon for the third time while Chris ran through mental calculations of probable enemy positions, and Jake simply sat with his eyes closed and his breathing slow and controlled. The ships hit the ground hard and the landing ramp dropped and the gravity slammed into them like a physical force as Jake stepped out onto Drakkar 4's surface, and he felt the weight immediately as his body suddenly weighed almost twice what it normally did, and every movement required more effort and more energy. But he had trained in high-gravity chambers back on Earth, and muscle memory took over as he adjusted his movements to compensate. The Corvin warriors grunted with effort as they moved toward the fortress, but they were built for this with heavy scales and powerful muscles, and they maintained their formation despite the increased weight. And the Vakreen soldiers were slower, and their insectoid legs struggled with the gravity, and several fell behind within the first 100 meters of the advance. Amy and Chris and Jake moved with the Corvin squad, and they were breathing harder than normal, and their faces showed the strain of the increased gravity. But they maintained pace, and more importantly, they maintained focus as Chris took point position and swept for threats while Amy covered the flank and Jake stayed in formation with Zaxor's warriors, as if he had trained with them for years instead of days. Zaxor watched the humans carefully as they advanced, and he noticed that they were compensating for the gravity in ways his own warriors did not, as they kept their movements economical and efficient, with no wasted motion, and they used the terrain to their advantage, and they maintained constant situational awareness despite the physical strain, and the war chief's combat computer was recording everything for later analysis. The breach went loud when shaped charges blew open a section of the fortress wall, and plasma fire erupted from defensive positions as Zareth defenders engaged the assault force, and the battle became chaos instantly, with explosions and screaming, and the smell of burning metal and flesh, and the assembly team poured through the breach, engaging enemies in close quarters combat, where training and instinct mattered more than careful planning. Jake moved through the chaos like water flowing around stones, and his rifle spoke in controlled bursts that dropped enemies with ruthless efficiency, and he saw threats before they materialized as his mind processed the battlefield faster than conscious thought, and when his weapon overheated, he transitioned to his sidearm without breaking stride, and when that emptied, he picked up a fallen Zareth rifle and continued fighting. Amy found herself separated from the main group when a secondary explosion collapsed part of the corridor, and she was pinned down with 3 wounded Vakreen soldiers, and Zareth warriors were advancing on their position with heavy armor that absorbed most of her plasma fire, and she looked at the wounded soldiers and then at the approaching enemy, and something shifted in her eyes as she made a decision. She charged directly at the Zareth, and the security footage from that corridor would later be studied at military academies across the assembly as an example of human combat capability, because Amy Pierce moved through 1.8 gravity while injured and operating on adrenaline and desperation, and she closed the distance to the first Zareth warrior before they could adjust their aim, and drove her combat knife into the neck joint of his armor. The fight lasted 17 seconds, and when it was over, 5 Zareth warriors were dead, and Amy was standing among their bodies with blood on her hands, and her breath coming in ragged gasps, and her eyes absolutely cold as she checked the wounded Vakreen soldiers and then dragged them one by one to a safer position, before collapsing the corridor behind them with a grenade to prevent pursuit. Chris Bennett earned his own recognition during the hostage extraction phase when the primary route to the evacuation point collapsed from structural damage and left dozens of civilians trapped with Zareth forces closing in from multiple directions, and Chris simply picked up 2 Threen civilians, one under each arm, and carried them through 300 meters of active combat zone, while his armor took hits that should have killed him. He reached the extraction ship and handed off the civilians and turned around and went back for more, and he made that trip 4 times carrying civilians who could not move fast enough in the heavy gravity and taking damage that would have stopped most species, but Chris just kept moving with mechanical determination until every civilian was safe, and only then did he allow the medics to check his injuries. Jake's squad reached the lower levels where the main group of hostages were being held, and they found Zareth defenders dug in with heavy weapons and prepared positions, and the corridor leading to the hostage chamber was a killing zone that would cost lives to cross. But the hostages did not have time for the assault force to find another route, so Jake did something that surprised even Zaxor. He stood up in full view of the Zareth positions and started walking down the corridor, firing as he moved, and he was taking hits to his armor, but he kept walking and kept firing, and his eyes were calculating every angle and every threat and eliminating them with cold precision. And the Zareth were so surprised by the audacity of a single warrior walking into their prepared positions that their response was delayed by crucial seconds. Zaxor's squad used those seconds to flank the Zareth positions and eliminate the defenders, and by the time Jake reached the hostage chamber, his armor was scorched and dented, and his left arm was bleeding from where a shot had penetrated. But he was still standing and still moving and still utterly focused on the mission as he helped breach the door and secure the hostages. The extraction was successful with all hostages recovered, and acceptable casualties among the assault force, and the Zareth fortress was destroyed to prevent its future use. But the real success was not in the mission objectives, but rather in the 40 assembly warriors who had fought beside humans for the first time, and seen with their own eyes what Deathworld evolution produced. Zaxor filed his after-action report 3 days later, and his words were measured, but their implications were profound, as he stated that humans possessed capabilities that exceeded their biological specifications by a significant margin, and that they demonstrated persistence and pain tolerance and tactical flexibility that matched or exceeded elite assembly. 3 months after the Drakkar IV operation, the Galactic Assembly convened for what everyone knew would be a historic vote, and the chamber was filled beyond capacity with representatives from every member species present, because this decision would shape the future of the Assembly in ways that no one could fully predict. And at the center of it all stood Ambassador Liu Wei, flanked by Commander Jake Morrison and Dr. Helen Carter. The Vikrine Prime Minister called the session to order, and its mandibles clicked in a slow rhythm that suggested careful consideration, and it began by acknowledging that the Assembly had reviewed extensive evidence over the past 6 months, including biological data and combat footage and testimony from warriors who had fought alongside humans, and consultation with historians and scientists from dozens of species. The Prime Minister stated that the initial assessment of humanity had been incomplete, because the Assembly had measured human baseline capabilities and assumed that represented the full extent of what humans could do, but the evidence now showed that humans operated on multiple levels with a resting state that was indeed below average, but with peak capabilities that far exceeded what their biology suggested should be possible. The Threen ambassador was invited to present the formal findings, and its colors shifted to blue and green, which meant respect mixed with caution, and it activated a holographic display that showed 3 extinct species, and explained that in 10,000 years of assembly history only 3 species had possessed what they now called the human factor, which was the ability to exceed biological limitations through mental discipline and emotional control. The display showed the Krell, who had nearly conquered half the galaxy before destroying themselves in civil war, and the Vathine, who were powerful psychics that could push their bodies beyond any reasonable limit, but had ultimately burned out their own biology, and the Ixians, who had been perhaps the most successful warrior race in galactic history, but were so efficient at warfare that other species had united specifically to stop them. Helen felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as she realized what the ambassador was implying, because these 3 species were not examples to aspire to, but rather warnings about what happened when Death World species entered galactic civilization, and all 3 had ended badly, either through self-destruction or through being destroyed by others who feared them. The Threen ambassador continued and explained that all 3 extinct species had evolved on Death Worlds, where survival required constant adaptation, and where predation was the primary evolutionary pressure, and where the only path to dominance was to become the apex predator. And the hologram shifted to show Earth with all its extreme climate variations and dangerous ecosystems and history of mass extinctions. The ambassador stated that Earth was classified as a Category 9 death world, which made it more hostile than the homeworlds that had produced the Krell or the Vathine or the Ixians, and this meant that humans had evolved under more extreme conditions than any of the previous Death World species, and the implications of this were both fascinating and deeply concerning. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the chamber, because most representatives had not known about the extinct species or about Earth's classification, and suddenly the question was not whether humans were capable enough to join the assembly, but whether they were too capable, and whether accepting them meant inviting the same disasters that had befallen previous Death World species. Zaxor stepped forward without being called, and his voice carried across the chamber, with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak through 400 battles, and he said that he had fought beside humans and against their enemies, and he wanted to address the concerns that he knew every representative was thinking about right now. He explained that yes, humans were dangerous, and yes, they possessed capabilities that were unsettling, and yes, they had evolved to be persistence predators who never quit and never backed down. But there was a crucial difference between humans and the extinct species that the Assembly feared, and that difference was choice. The Krell had been warriors who knew only domination, and the Vathine had been so focused on individual power that they forgot cooperation, and the Ixians had been efficient killers who saw every interaction as a potential conflict. But humans were different because they had developed both the capacity for violence and the capacity for compassion in equal measure, and more importantly, they had developed the wisdom to choose between them. Zaxor described watching Amy Pierce run into fire to save a Threen family she had never met, and watching Chris Bennett carry civilians through combat zones while taking damage that should have killed him, and watching Jake Morrison risk his life to protect beings who had rejected his species as too weak, and he pointed out that these were not the actions of a species that valued only domination and violence. He said that humans fought with terrifying efficiency when fighting was necessary, but they also showed compassion and self-sacrifice when compassion was needed, and they transitioned between these states instantly and naturally, as if both violence and kindness came from the same source, and in a way they did because humans protected fiercely what they loved deeply. A Corvin counselor stood and pointed out that intention could change, and that a species that was cooperative now might become aggressive later, especially once they had integrated fully into assembly technology and infrastructure and gained access to resources and knowledge that could make them even more dangerous than they already were. Liu stepped forward to address this concern, and his voice was calm but firm, as he explained that humans understood this fear because they had been afraid of themselves for their entire history, and every human culture had myths and stories about the danger of unchecked aggression and the need for restraint and wisdom, and these were not abstract concepts but rather fundamental parts of human psychology. He explained that humans had nearly destroyed themselves dozens of times through wars and weapons and environmental damage, and they had learned through hard experience that the ability to dominate did not mean you should dominate, and that true strength came not from defeating others but from choosing not to when you could. Helen added scientific evidence showing that human brain structure included unusually developed regions associated with empathy and social bonding and moral reasoning, and these were not vestigial traits, but rather active parts of human cognition that shaped every decision and action, and humans were literally built to care about others, even others who were completely different from themselves. The Vakrine Prime Minister raised all four arms to signal that the debate phase was ending, and it stated that the Council had heard evidence both concerning and encouraging about humanity, and now the Assembly must decide whether the potential benefits of human membership outweighed the potential risks, and whether they were willing to trust a Death World species to become equal partners in galactic civilization. The vote was called, and representatives activated their voting crystals, and the chamber fell silent as the results were tallied, and Liu felt Jake tense slightly beside him, and Helen was gripping her data pad so hard her knuckles were white, and the silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. The vote was not unanimous because some species still feared what humans represented and voted against membership, but the majority voted yes, and the Vakrine Prime Minister announced that by the authority vested in the Assembly, humanity was granted full member status with all rights and responsibilities that entailed. Liu bowed respectfully and thanked the Assembly for their trust and promised that humanity would work to prove worthy of it, and Jake nodded once in acknowledgement, and Helen smiled with visible relief, and across the chamber various representatives reacted with emotions ranging from celebration to concern to cautious optimism. But Zaxor had added one condition before the vote, and he stated that the Assembly needed to understand humans better if they were going to work together effectively, and therefore humans would share their military training protocols and psychological conditioning methods, and human officers would be assigned to train with each member species' military force. Jake agreed immediately because he understood that this was not just about teaching other species to fight like humans, but rather about building trust through shared experience and understanding. And if assembly warriors trained beside humans and learned how humans thought and fought, then they would be less likely to fear humans in the future. The session ended and representatives began filing out. But small groups of alien warriors approached the human delegation, wanting to talk and ask questions and understand what humans were and how they did what they did. And Liu noticed that the tone had shifted from the curiosity of observers to the respect of peers. A young Vakreen officer approached Chris, who was standing quietly to one side, and the officer asked how Chris had continued fighting while carrying such heavy loads, and Chris gave the same answer he had given before, which was that the civilians needed help, so he helped them and everything else was just details. The Vakreen officer's mandibles clicked in what might have been frustration, and it pointed out that this did not really explain anything, and Chris smiled slightly and said that maybe that was the point, because